I am very pleased to be here today and talk about how I did get to the point I am. I've got an MD, an MBA, and I am currently a postdoc fellow. So I will be talking about women's health research that I've been involved in. I will be talking about reproductive justice, explaining what that is exactly, and how I've been involved with it. But I also want to leave time for questions and answers at the end. I love this picture because it's a very accurate representation of what people think success looks like and what it actually looks like. Some people agree that the path, the journey is not linear. It's all over the place. That's my experience. If you'll notice, this picture at the top right has an asterisk. It's because this is true. Sometimes you can't predict the future or what will happen. You can't predict what will happen to you, but you can take ownership of what happens and figure out another way around or another plan if it interrupts your preset plans that you had. Of course, I can't talk about my journey without showing at least one baby picture. I was lucky. I happened to be born into a deaf family and was exposed to sign language from birth on up. This is kind of an ironic picture because I'm sitting at a piano and people think deaf people can't play a piano, of course, but I think from an early age, I already realized or understood that I could do whatever I wanted to. If I wanted to play the piano, I could. And my family was very supportive of whatever I wanted to do. I am a Rochester girl, was born and raised here in Rochester, love it here. So I went to the Rochester School for the Deaf, and I loved that experience. I had great teachers. Some of my classes, like math, for example, I would notice that different students would have, in my class, would have a different book than me that they were learning from, a different textbook. So we were all at different levels, but we were accommodated for the level that we were at. And I remember one of my best and favorite teachers was very accommodating to us individual students. And that is something that I have taken to heart, and it's become ingrained in me. And that has actually led to my high school experience, which was a little bit different. Now, again, I went to RSD, the Rochester School for the Deaf, until 7th grade. I decided that I was curious about other students and their experiences at other schools. So I told my mom or my parents that I wanted to go to a public school. They said that was fine. So for 7th grade, I went to public school, started 7th grade in the public school. And after a few days, I told my parents that I was overwhelmed, even after just a few days, because I had an interpreter. Now, when I was at the School for the Deaf, I could easily oversee other conversations and join in, but I didn't have that experience at the public school. So I realized that I thought I wanted to go back to the deaf school so I could be involved in anything that I wanted to. So I went back to the deaf school for a few days and realized that I wanted to go back to the public school. I told my mom. She's like, okay, we'll let you go back. So I did that. I realized that I did like the public school environment, the activities, the things that I can be involved in, but I missed the deaf environment and my friends there. So I was able to do a half and half day. So half the day I would go to the deaf school and half the day I would go to the public school. I would go in the morning to the public school, and then the afternoon I would go to the deaf school. So I really had the best of both worlds during high school. I do feel sorry for my parents because they had to suffer through 2 high school graduations. I'm sure that my parents were just sitting there kind of like, all right, are we almost done with this? But no, maybe not. Maybe they were excited to get through it. graduated high school and got into college at RIT. And of course, I still had that curiosity just ingrained in me. I was interested in a variety of different things. And when I filled out my application for RIT admissions, I had to put down my major, which I wasn't sure yet. So what I put down was software engineering and computer game design. I'm not really sure why I did that, but I did so. Now, I think it's because I loved the Sims computer game. So I decided that I could make or design or create a game, but that's not true. Playing and designing are totally different things. Anyway, so I was very shortly in the computer software program and then changed to psychology. And I was very interested in psychology, went through 2 years of courses, and there was a course that Dr. Peter Hauser was teaching, and it was called the
Biological Basis of Mental Disorders, and it was a mixture of psychology and heavy science and research. For that class, I started waking up at 8 in the morning to do my homework and get to class, so I realized I really was interested in this topic very much. So I talked to Peter, told him that I was thinking about something after my bachelor's degree, told me to think about psychology or medical school maybe. So I graduated from RIT with my bachelor's in psychology and pre-medical science. Now the college is called the School of Individualized Studies, SOIS. It was a different name back when I was in the program, but it was a variety of courses that I took for psychology as well as the pre-medical courses. So I graduated in 2008 with my bachelor's, and then 2009 I graduated with my MBA. I did the fast track MBA program. It was crazy. So I graduated with my bachelor's on Friday and then started my MBA studies on Monday. That following Monday, I had the weekend off, and that was basically it. Now, during the summer, I did have some breaks in between the course sessions, and I did have some courses that had transferred in to help me fast track. But I already knew that I enjoyed science and psychology. I did like the business part, but it wasn't for me. I just wanted additional tools to be able to carry with me. Now, these are just 2 examples of mentors that I had at RIT. Mentors are vital. Some mentors that you have may have a small, not unimportant role, but maybe a small role, and some others may have a larger role in your career development. Some may be a deaf mentor, maybe a hearing mentor. Some may be related to your field or not. Some of your mentors may not be specifically professional mentors, but personal mentors, just to help you get through life. And some you may not actually officially label mentor. So these are 2 examples of my mentors. But Terry, Dr. Kim, she was a tutor that I had at RIT, and thank God for her help. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a scientist, a researcher, go into the medical field, and Terry was helpful for that. Dr. Kim's lab was a wet lab that I worked in for 2 quarters, and it was okay. It was important for me to get the experience, but I realized that this was a big no for me. I didn't like that type of work. So in early 2004 was when I went into RIT and started taking psychology classes. At that time, Peter had the Deaf Studies Lab. So I had my experience in the wet lab, Dr. Kim's lab, and then I also had my experience, a dry lab experience with Dr. Hauser. Sometimes people think that a deaf mentor, just because they're deaf, are going to be a good mentor, and a hearing mentor, just because they're hearing, won't be a good mentor for a deaf person, and that's not true. I've learned that there are differences in people just in general. For example, one deaf person whom I won't name, I was excited because I was thinking about going to medical school, so I decided to tell them, and they told me that I should think of a plan B. Now, they weren't wrong in that I needed to have a plan B, but that was the only thing that they said. So I wish that they had explained why they said that. I didn't ask further questions. I just remember realizing at that time that it seemed like they were being sort of closed-minded. So that was a deaf mentor, but anyway, I will hold on that and explain a little bit more later. And of course, sometimes your mentors can become your friends, and they don't have a strict boundary between that mentor professional relationship and friendship. So this is a picture of several people who have had an impact on my life thus far. Once I graduated, well, really, when I was getting closer to graduation, I started studying for the MCAT, the Medical College Admissions Test. I wanted to have that completed so that I could apply to medical school as soon as I graduated. So I got the MCAT book, and I am not joking. I remember looking at the first page. I didn't even finish reading it. It talked about the chemical something of water. I don't even know. I put it aside. I realized medical school was a big commitment of time, money, emotions, energy, everything. And I realized that I didn't want to do that just yet because I still had that curiosity inside and wanted to see what else was out there for me. So I applied at the National Center for Deaf Health Research. And this is another type of research. More tri-lab type of work, more public health type of work. They have a variety of activities related to community health, and not only deaf people, but hearing people as well. The picture at the bottom, the people you see here, are for Deaf Strong Hospital. It's role reversal for students who are becoming doctors, pharmacists, receptionists, etc., those who are in the healthcare system. For first-year medical students, typically hearing people, they have this experience at Deaf Strong Hospital. We put them in the deaf world, and they have to figure out how to communicate in a sign language that they do not know. It's a very humbling exercise for them to realize that when they meet a patient that doesn't speak English as their first language, they should think about how they provide their care to them.
And another thing while I worked for NCDHR was that I got exposed to educational activities. So, for example, they wanted me to make a vlog about some medical concepts. And at the time I worked there, H1N1, the flu was a small pandemic at the time. And so I made some vlogs explaining different parts of that. And that was the first time that I experienced doing that. I think sometimes you have to look back and laugh at yourself a little bit and also realize how far you've come since then. So I hope you agree. I have this vlog to show you today. I think it's not great quality, but go ahead and take a look at it. When you use a thermometer to take your temperature, if the temperature is 100.5, that means that you have a fever. If it's 100.1 or higher, that means you have a high fever. Now, a fever is a symptom, just a symptom of a flu or cold, and a cold is typically more mild compared to flu. So technically, technology was very different back then compared to what it is today. But that helped me learn more knowledge, comfort, and confidence being in front of the camera. So that was a good exposure for me and helped me start realizing that I did want to focus on education, community empowerment, making sure that people, knew how to take care of themselves. So at that point, I realized that I was ready to make that big commitment of going to medical school at the University of Rochester School of Medicine. Now, some of the pictures here show the people who supported me through medical school, my family, of course, my friends, and friends that I made in medical school. Most of my experiences before medical school working with interpreters and access services were much different. At Rochester School for the Deaf, I never had to worry about it. When I went into public school was the first time that I used interpreters. And I used interpreters somewhat at RIT, but in medical school, the interpreters took a different role than I was used to. In the past, I just went in the room, the interpreter was already there. I typically didn't have a lot of conversations with them. But when I got into medical school, I realized that the roles changed and our boundaries had to change. And sometimes we became pretty close to the point of friendship, like we were in the back of a cop car together. I'm just kidding about that. But I had what were called designated interpreters, and I had a team of 5 designated interpreters who regularly worked with me, and they knew me very well, and I knew them very well. I really should say 6, including myself, as part of that team, because I truly did become part of that team. I often had to feed them based on, especially during my 3rd and 4th year in medical school. At that time, I had more confidence and more knowledge about medicine, and sometimes the interpreters would interpret something and the same way that doctors' handwriting is notoriously bad, sometimes doctors' pronunciation isn't very clear, sometimes they mumble, sometimes the acronyms are so complex that the interpreters would try their best, but sometimes they weren't able to catch what it was, and sometimes I could and help them out. So it's something that I look back as being kind of funny, developing that relationship with interpreters. So I did use interpreters throughout medical school, but medical school is really a whole different language in and of itself. The vocabulary, the jargon, which words they pick when they speak. Doctors have their own language in that way. And I often felt that it was more difficult working with interpreters. I wanted to have CART instead because it was easier to see the written English. And that was an entirely different experience too, because the classes were so fast paced. Having the information on CART was helpful and did help me learn some of that medical jargon better too. Now, with patients, typically what I did was I would go up to patients and introduce myself using spoken English and introduce the interpreters and let them know that if there's anything I didn't understand that the patient said, that I would look to the interpreters because the priority was communication. And I never had a problem with that. Patients never had a problem with it. If I was needed to hear their breathing or their heart rhythm, I would use a visual stethoscope. And really, the sign that I use for stethoscope is like it's going in my ears, but it's really just a device. It doesn't go in my ears, of course, because I don't need to use my ears. It connected directly to my cochlear implant so that I was able to hear it a bit more clearly that way. And then the operating room was another situation where I had to figure out what to do. At that time, the masks with a clear lens were not widely available. So as a medical student, I had to use a regular mask, meaning that the interpreters couldn't see my lips, but I needed to see the interpreter's face. So the interpreters would use what you see in the picture, and those are called ortho hoods, where there's a clear covering. And that's more often used for joint replacement surgery. So we were able to borrow some of those hoods that the interpreters could wear. Now, the hood has a fan in it, and the fan is because if there were not a fan, then it would become hot and it would also become foggy so that the interpreters wouldn't be able to see through it. So the fan is important, but it also makes a lot of background noise. So another piece of equipment that we had to use was a microphone. The interpreters had a microphone and a headset in their ear, so we would have to predict which of the surgeons or residents would be speaking the most. And then we would try to catch them, whoever would be speaking the most, and we would ask them to wear a microphone. Most of them were fine, almost all of them were fine. Once in a while, they would be resistant to it, but most of the time it was fine. One memory that really stands out to me that tells me how well the system worked was that I worked with one resident in the emergency burn unit. And I think after 3 or 4 days, we were scrubbing in together to get ready to go into the OR. And they pulled me aside and said, I have to tell you, the first day we met, I was really unsure about working with you because I didn't know how you could do it being deaf. But then as we were working together, I see that you have a system, communication is very clear, and everything went fine. And that really made me proud. And I'm really glad that they told me that. That showed me and validated that my system worked and that having open communication worked and that we were able to make that happen. So often people ask me, why did I pick women's health? There are so many different fields of medicine, pediatrics, surgery, everything, and I picked women's health. And typically my answer is that women's health picked me. That's the best answer I can give. I really enjoy working with women patients. I feel more connected with them and I enjoy empowering them. I want to be inclusive and make sure that they have access to all of the information that they need. I think one of the most fun things you can do in medicine is deliver babies. I really, really enjoyed getting to do that. So I want to show a couple pictures here of important people who supported me through medical school and the people who really were my rock to help me get through and survive medical school. Okay, so after I graduated medical school, I didn't do a residency. I decided I want to go back to research. So I talked with Dr. Peter Hauser again, and he suggested a one-year postdoc. Now, I had worked in the Deaf Studies Lab, and that's the old logo for Deaf Studies Lab at the top, and that's now merged into the NTID Research Center on Culture and Language, and that's the logo at the bottom. So I did a one-year research postdoc where I learned more about deaf health literacy and also did some research on cancer prevention, specifically for women. For example, pap smears, mammograms, that type of research. And from that experience, I decided that I definitely wanted to pursue women's health research. Other research that I had done in the past didn't really stick with me as well. I thought I would enjoy it, but I realized that I really needed to find a topic that I enjoyed researching and something that would make me want to wake up at 8 o'clock every morning to keep working on it. And women's health research did that. So after the one-year postdoc, I joined the Rochester Postdoctorate Partnership for a 3-year postdoc. And I'm finishing my 3rd year of that program. And now I've fully transitioned from clinical to research. And my research is on women's health and reproductive justice. Now, women's health is very, very broad. I'm primarily focused on contraceptive use and pregnancy. Health literacy is important, and I looked into that more, but I'm more interested in women's health, deaf women's health, and their access to healthcare. So before I go into my research too much, I want to take a moment to talk about a brief literature review of what's already been studied. So women's health research is a fairly new field of a topic of research. A publication was done that said that women's health issues have been overlooked because there aren't enough women in the medical field. And that proves that representation is so important. Anytime someone is in a field, they will notice something that applies to them about that specific topic. So deaf research needs to include deaf women, and women's research needs to include women researchers. So in general, regardless of deaf or hearing, women need to be involved in research, and especially deaf women need to be involved in deaf women's research. So this is a brief introduction of deaf women's health so far, what we know about it. So we know that health literacy is somewhat blocked by society, meaning that access to health information in sign language is not equal. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with that. Often either the doctor, the healthcare scenario doesn't always provide an interpreter. And of course, signing practitioners are not very easy to find. So knowledge of STDs and contraceptives are not as strong in deaf women. Deaf women are also more likely to rely on the use of condoms and the withdrawal method, both of which are not very effective. They have a high chance of accidental pregnancies as a result. So comparing deaf women to hearing women, deaf women are somewhat more open. In the past year, I've had a couple different people, by saying, for example, in the past year, I've had a few different people that I had sex with. And then some new research here based on data is that data sets are often fairly small. They often aren't a national sample, but they're fairly small local samples of deaf women. So what we have so far is fairly limited. And specifically for risky behavior and unintended pregnancies, if women are using uh, contraceptives that have a higher risk of unintended pregnancies, then of course it is more likely that they will have unintended pregnancies. So why do we care about unintended pregnancies? First of all, it's important to know that annually, out of all pregnancies in the US, almost a third of them are accidental or unplanned. And if we look at deaf women specifically, just this year, a publication was done on a study that found that deaf women had 67% higher chance of unintended pregnancies or pregnancies that weren't planned. And unplanned pregnancies do have some different negative health consequences associated with them. There are 4 of them that I list here. And you'll notice that there are citations for each of these. Those citations are not about unintended pregnancies, but they're specifically about deaf people who fall into these categories. So, for example, for unintended pregnancies, that means that there's often delayed or no medical care for pregnant women. And we know that we don't know specifically about deaf women's healthcare when they're pregnant, but we know that there is not enough data on that. And it seems that there is something missing in the care of deaf women who are pregnant. And postpartum depression is also higher for unintended pregnancies. We don't know the specifics of that in deaf women. We don't know the percentage of deaf women who have postpartum depression, but we do know that deaf people in general have a higher incidence of depression, anxiety, and some other issues. So we need to do more studies to identify specifically the deaf experience and postpartum, the experience of deaf women with postpartum depression. And intimate partner violence, IPV, which is very similar to domestic violence. We know that unintended pregnancies have, there's a higher chance of unintended pregnancies in situations of IPV or domestic violence. And if we look at college students over the past 12 months, deaf women are twice as likely to say that they have experienced IPV in the past year compared to hearing college students. So that's very serious. The final thing here about unintended pregnancies is that women are less likely to breastfeed if they are accidentally pregnant, and breastfeeding has many positive consequences associated with it. Now, it's possible that deaf women who are more open with information and more likely to share and encourage other deaf women may be more likely to breastfeed, but we have also seen that deaf women may not have the same access to language or same access to health information when communicating with their doctors. So it's possible that deaf women are more likely to give up on breastfeeding if it's not successful. And again, that's not associated specifically with unintended pregnancies, but it is something that may be there. There may be an association there. Yeah. And then for unintended pregnancies, another consideration is that sometimes there's not enough time between pregnancies.
So now why do I care about pregnancy spacing and the time between births? It seems that the best time between pregnancies is about 18 months from the time of one birth to the beginning of the next pregnancy. A third of all U.S. pregnancies are conceived within 18 months. And when that happens, there are several consequences that can potentially occur. First is preterm birth. Second is a low birth weight, which can lead to other health problems that I won't go into now. And third is placenta abruption. The placenta is very important for feeding nutrients to the baby. So if an abruption happens, the nutrients cannot get to the baby, and the mother could have some internal bleeding, which can be risky for their health. Just looking at IPV only, not comparing deaf and hearing, but IPV itself, it seems that these three issues that I discussed, the preterm birth weight, low birth weight, and placental abruption, can happen within IPV relationships and the women who are in those relationships. But it also seems that deaf women have a higher chance of experiencing these consequences that are negative. Interesting to discuss and to see. So these things can be avoided with more effective birth control options. One is called long-acting reversible contraceptives, LARC. One is an IUD, or intrauterine device. One looks like this, you can see here. It's very small, kind of cute. That is inserted into the uterus. And another type is an implant. If you can see it here. And that typically goes in the arm. These devices are nice because they can last from 3 to 12 years, depending on which method and which brand, etc. But 3 to 12 years. And they are 99% effective as well. So now, what predicts what women will use which methods? The age seems to be 25 to 34 years of age, the women who use these devices. Often, it's an older age that women think that they might start using these devices. They may have tried other devices up to this point, and this may be a new method that they want to try. So I interviewed 20 deaf women and 20 hearing women. We wanted to gather more information and take a more qualitative approach before we did the quantitative approach for analyses. We had questions about what they knew, what information they had access to. We also asked about birth control and what knowledge they had about different methods. There seemed to be a common dissatisfaction with what was learned from school and from parents. Often when the women that we interviewed would ask their parents would say, well, you'll be learning that in school, so wait until you learn that. And then when they would maybe ask in school, they would be told to ask their parents. So it kind of goes back and forth. There were some individuals who had access to interpreters. Some did not have such access to interpreters and lacked an access to the information. Sometimes the doctor would talk about birth control and only discuss medicine, the pills that could be taken, and not discuss the other options that there were. And the interviewee would just accept the doctor's suggestions and not ask more. And there were others who would ask more questions of their doctor to get more in-depth information. Sometimes it's difficult to get information in your preferred modality, whether from a doctor or parents or whomever. It's important to get clear information. And what we found was important to these women we interviewed was conversations with their friends and their peers. And sometimes that was the first time that they ever learned about a variety of things that we asked. And it was through discussions with their peers that they finally learned about things. Now, those who preferred having an interpreter at their doctor's appointments, sometimes the interpreter wouldn't be clear. Sometimes there wouldn't be an interpreter and they would need to write back and forth or rely on pictures. Another important thing was open communication with their parents, not just sexual education information, but just open communication in general. Sometimes a deaf woman might feel comfortable asking their parents because their parents are open-minded and they can talk about a variety of things, but sometimes that's not the case. Now remember, I interviewed both hearing and deaf women, 20 of each, and I thought that they might be fairly equal or there might be some disparities, but they were actually fairly equal in their responses. Both hearing and deaf women felt that sex education was lacking and that they needed more information and they could have used more information when they were younger. Also, doctors often give brief descriptions or only a few options for birth control and not sufficient options. And then also, those who use maybe English as a second language sometimes have difficulty getting the communication or getting access to the information that they need in the mode that they need or prefer. Now, in my last year of my postdoc, I have been thinking about my goals for the future and what I would like to do. So I, of course, have a variety of experience now with research and getting support in that area. I first want to credit this organization's sister song for this quote. Reproductive justice is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. It could be rephrased, but important is the concept. It's a human right for us to be able to make our own decisions. And to have that ability to make your own decisions, you have to have these 3 things that I have listed here. Comprehensive contraceptive counseling. First of all, you have to know everything that's out there. You have to have access to contraception and be able to get it. And then, of course, accessible information about reproductive health and contraception. Now, from my research and literature reviews I've done, deaf women don't seem to have comprehensive contraceptive counseling. They also don't often have access to contraception. And of course, they struggle getting enough information in an accessible language to them. So without these 3 things, when they're lacking these 3 things, they don't feel they have personal autonomy, and that means that they don't yet have reproductive justice either. So that is what I plan to do more research on. All right, going back a little bit to about me, after I started my postdoc, I have a requirement to go to several conferences each year. So I went to a presentation about deaf individuals in science. It was a really important presentation because it was going to be more diverse and more representative of science and what it could look like. So one person in the audience really felt impacted by the presentation. And they said that they felt that it could be applied more widely. They told me that I also should apply for the AAAS If Then Ambassador program. The point of this program is to encourage middle school girls to feel like they can go into STEM fields if they want to. So I went to the conference last year. This is a picture from that conference. I'm standing next to Gina Davis. She's a famous actress. She was on Grey's Anatomy and also in a movie called League of Their Own. You may be familiar with the baseball movie about a women's baseball team. So I had an opportunity to meet her and really a number of amazing women in science. And we just all inspired each other.
The first is to be open to trying different things. I'm always curious and I'm always excited about a new opportunity. And I think that's very important because that's how you find what you like and don't like. You never know where you'll end up. My second tip is to prioritize clear communication. And basically by that, I've heard from other people who are deaf in the medical field who say that a good general suggestion is that when you meet with someone, after you meet with them, it's always a good idea to send an email to follow up and summarize your discussion with them and say, this is what we talked about, this is what I'll do, and this is what you'll do. as a follow-up to the meeting. And I think that was a great tip because understandings can happen and you want to do your best to avoid that. The third tip is, of course, to be positive and have gratitude. Think about the things that you're grateful for and who and what helped you get to where you are, your mentors, friends, and family who have supported you along the way. The third is that it's important to balance everything you do. Most of you who know me know that I love baking, and sometimes it's okay to combine baking and science, but normally baking is just for fun. But of course, I do love integrating medicine with baking. You can see the EKG lines on the hearts here. Some are normal and some are not normal. And I also love making cookies with medical designs on them too. So I hope that this QR code works. You should be able to scan it and it will save my information to your phone. So if you'd like to contact me with any questions, any thoughts that you have, I'm always open to talking with you. And I'm very grateful to my mentor. And because of that, I want to pass it on. And I'm happy to be a mentor to anyone who needs it.